Hello and welcome to Postgres FM, a show about all things PostgreSQL. I am Michael, founder of PG Mustard, and I'm joined as usual by Nik, founder of Postgres AI. Hey Nik.
Hi Michael, how are you?
I am doing okay, thank you. How are you?
Recovering from some bad flu, but all good.
Yeah, good to have you back. And yeah, so what are we talking about today?
Let's talk about metadata and various meanings, and including like comments, maybe more, right? Comments to database objects, comments inside queries, inside PLPGSQL stored procedures and functions. Just broadly, what kind of metadata it makes sense to store and how? Pros and cons, I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. And also some like side effects of having it in there or use cases. I was actually quite surprised we hadn't talked about it already. I saw a recent blog post by Marcus Winand on modern SQL about, I think it was mostly actually about, it was called SQL comments, but it was mostly about
Is it recent?
query. I think so.
It doesn't have date, and by default, I assume all the posts are like very old. Somehow, I think so. But yeah, maybe it's new stuff. But it's very small post, right?
Yeah, but small, but also it's one of those on modern SQL. He has these like nice visualizations of which databases have supported which syntax from which dates, and I always enjoy those when
I also enjoy, but practically, I rarely leave the ecosystem of Postgres, so it's just okay. Good to know Postgres is good here as well, and here, and that's it.
Occasionally, you come across them where Postgres doesn't support some syntax that another database does. It's not common, but I have been caught out a few times thinking, oh, wow, or not caught out, but surprised thinking, oh, it's interesting there are somewhere Oracle or SQL Server have some new syntax that's even in the standard that we don't yet have. So it isn't often, and it is really nice to see especially the dark green ticks. It's like fully compliant tick, no little subtext on how it deviates from the standard or anything else. Yeah, but that was about query level comments, so single line and multi-line comments.
Yeah, and in the main like SQL runtime, like usually there is a standard minus like comment style. And it's interesting to see that MySQL and MariaDB, they have issues there. There's a requirement to have white space after two hyphens.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, Postgres supports that because it's standard, and also it supports C-style comments.
Exactly.
/*/. Yeah.
Which crucially can be, they're good for multi-line comments, aren't they? So you can have the first /* and then also start writing.
I try to use them all the time because they are predictable. If you use SQL standard comments, you might have issues when, for example, in some cases, your query line endings are stripped from your query. Right? In this case, it's quite a messed up situation because everything becomes a comment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I wasn't going to bring this up till later because it felt like a really minor detail, but I was relatively surprised to read that pSQL strips out the single line, the standard comments, before even sending them to the service, whereas it doesn't for multi-lines. So yeah, exactly, client side. So when they're used, for example, if you want that information server side for some reason, it needs to be one of the C-style comments.
Yeah, and we do have situations where we appreciate comments, for example, coming to pgstat statements. Let's start with pgstat activity, first of all. Comments for queries can be super useful to pass some, I don't know, like trace ID, like origin, even URL sometimes. Like you can indicate which part of your application generated this query or participated in generation, right? There are some libraries for different languages. I remember one for Ruby on Rails. It's called Marginalia or Marginalia. I don't know.
It'll be margin because it's from I think from the margins. Like when you in a book, if you write some little notes about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very useful. It can bring automatically generated comments to your queries, which are coming from Ruby on Rails ORM, and it's helpful to trace to analyze and quickly find where this query is coming from. And also how, like, we obviously can see them in pgset activity. The downside, obviously, that it increases the size of the query, and by default, pgset activity, the query column, it has only 1024 characters. Track activity query size setting. We usually recommend it to bump it like 10x.
Yeah.
Because we have memory for it. Yeah, let's do it. Because queries tend to be bigger and bigger over years, right? So 1000 is not enough. And if, of course, this comment is put in front of the query, and you might not be able to see, unfortunately, how SQL is written. It starts with select. And sometimes ORMs, they put a lot of columns there. And with comment plus column list, you might see that it's truncated and you don't see the from clause at all. And to see the from clause, it's super essential. There are opinions that SQL, like select,
it's the wrong way around.
Reorganized starting with from, because this is where things start to be executed. But it is as it is. And so it's, if you have a huge helpful comment, it might bite you here because you might have your query trimmed faster and you don't see it. But it is what it is, right? So my recommendation is comments are super helpful here, like from this library, or you can write your own or something, just to trace the origin of a query and so on. And you just need to bump your track activity query size to have bigger. Unfortunately, it requires restart. That's the downside of that change.
I actually don't know for sure, but I was looking at the marginalia documentation briefly just before this and noticed that the comments were going at the end of the query. So it might be that they've deliberately done that.
In this case, you don't see it in pgset activity, maybe, right? Because
good point. Maybe it's even worse. Yeah.
And what would be great actually I don't know, this is strange, but I recently implemented in our monitoring. I was hearing it's difficult, but then I just took Cloud Code and implemented it, and it was quite successful. So I implemented the approach I saw in other systems. So we have a mode now in our dashboards in Grafana. We like basically a switch. You can see the whole query, or you can see the query with stripped less important parts. And I consider the column list as less important part, and I just replace it with, right, not ... but a single symbol. There is Unicode, triple dot. And in this case, you have more useful information. And comments, I think, I also strip in this case, right? But
makes sense.
Depending on situation, comments can be helpful for various like observability activities to connect some dots. And interesting how comments in queries, for example, coming in front of... Oh, by the way, big downside of having comment in front of query is also that in our old checkup, we had analysis so-called mid-level. So we had high level, it's just the whole workload, all metrics for the whole workload, according to like from pgset statements. Of course, it's not the whole, usually like it's only 5,000 by default queries, normalized queries. But the lowest level, it's individual normalized query, right? Mid-level is when we call it so-called first word analysis. So we just, which word is the first? Okay, select, or is it update? There is a trick with, because with can combine multiple things in one query. But usually it's quite helpful to understand how many of queries in terms of calls or overall timing, some metric, how many of them are selects versus updates and deletes. You can get stats for writes from tuple statistics, but to analyze at query level, it's not like straightforward. So this is what we did. And then I remember having comments destroy this analysis. Of course, this is a matter like you just, it's easy to fix, right? You can just ignore comments. Yeah, but this is interesting. So bringing some observability helpers, you might destroy some observability tools sometimes.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to make sure we mentioned it in this area was how pgstat statements works, because it does denormalize. So comments, I think it's quite a good trade-off actually. I think I quite like the decision they've made. So they denormalize. So if you have the same query but with two different comments, they will count as the same query. You'll get the same query ID, they'll be grouped together. But only the first one that gets stored under that query ID
And it's stored
while it's
raw, unchanged.
is
So
stored
it's not
exactly
normal.
unchanged with the comment. Exactly.
For example, imagine we have a simple select with blah, 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 where, I don't know, like email equals some value or lower of email equals some value. And you decide to put this email as a comment. This is how your PII leaks to PG stat statements, but only the first occurrence. That's weird. So
Yeah, I don't know if I've seen. Have you seen PII in comments? That's
it's
interesting.
an imaginary situation. It's possible, right?
Sure.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. For example, we can say, okay, this is user with email. This is acting here, and we have it's leaked to PG stat statements. Everything else is stripped, so like it's normalized. We don't see parameters, but comments we see only first occurrence. This is weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's weird, but I quite like. Imagine. I was thinking, what's the alternative? Either they don't show comments at all, or they have to store loads of copies.
Yeah, there are pros and cons here, and yeah, what I would like to see, it's an unresolved problem still. I would like to have ability to pass comments as maybe key value pairs, comma separated or white space separated. For example, you say, okay, application ID this or application component ID this, like correlation ID, many things, right? URL, and then to be able to have aggregated metrics based on those dimensions, right? So, for example, I know my application consists of various components. I pass this component ID to comments, and then I want to say, I want to see how many calls overall for this query particularly, how many calls are coming from that component ID versus different component ID. And this type of analysis would be super powerful, basically custom dimensions for PGStat statements.
Yeah.
I know it was discussed for PGStat K-cache, and the consensus was it should be in PGStat statements. And it was many years ago, and I don't know how it ended. But definitely there is like desire to have some kind of analysis, but I imagine it can be quite expensive if implemented not in a good way. But yeah, this is what people want. They come with questions like, okay, how to identify, we have like many parts of, we have monolith, first of all, in terms of code.
Yeah.
We have many teams working on different parts. How to identify which part is most expensive in terms of CPU usage, for example.
Yeah.
Or time spent by database to process this. And here is where such kind of analysis would be super helpful.
Do you see people doing it, like you could, for example, have them connect with different roles, and that would then be logged?
Yes, this is one way. This is indirect. Like you could just downgrade this. Like I just pictured very good, flexible approach that you could do many dimensions, but you can downgrade and let your different parts of application speak using different users, and use the fact that PGStat statements has user ID.
Yeah.
The downside of this approach would be you need to think how to manage pools in PGBouncer, for example, right? Because different users means you need to set different quotas, pool sizes, right?
Yeah.
This can be quite inflexible. If you want to have a single quota for all users, how?
Yeah.
Maybe it's a question to PGBouncer. Maybe it's actually possible, maybe no. It's another question, right? So once this is, I think, good practice to separate your workload to different segments, and each segment works under different DB user. But there is also management overhead for maintaining various limits and so on.
Yeah.
I think it's solvable. I forgot how. So it's an interesting, maybe some of our listeners has a clear picture what best practice would be here, and please leave a comment somewhere.
Yeah, or even just what people are doing, what you're doing in practice. It'd be good to hear what solutions people have come up with.
What's possible right now, I think, is if you, for example, have quite high track activity query size, like 10K, for example. I see people even go further, like even more, like 30K. And you use comments like from Marginalia or something. and you have already, you started to appreciate performance insights or weight event analysis. We talked about it a lot, right? In this case, you can start, so you can recognize different weight events and how many active sessions and segment them by weight event type and weight event. In this case, you can bring this knowledge about dimensions to this analysis and start saying, okay, we have usually like this amount of sessions spending on IO, and among them, like 90% is coming from that part of our application according to comments. This is quite powerful. And this, you don't need to do anything except like just to, you don't need to change PG statements or how Postgres works. It's possible right now already.
Yeah, as long as two parts of your application aren't doing the same query. Yeah, that would be fun.
They can do same query, but they put different comments.
Yeah,
so
but
you
in
can
PG
distinguish
statements, not in PG
No,
statements.
I'm talking about weight event analysis.
Sorry. Yeah,
and I'm
I
talking
understand.
actually about, we call it lazy approach, like sampling of PGST activity.
Fine.
It cannot be super frequent because there is overhead. So for example, every second or every 5 seconds you sample PGST activity and you have a raw query from there, including comments as is.
Yeah.
If you start using weight sampling, which is great in terms of sampling rate, 10 milliseconds, every 10 milliseconds by default it samples, but you lose this. You lose the raw query and comments, and you have the same problem as PG statements. These dimensions become not available at PG weight sampling level. So anyway, this is a super interesting observability topic, I think. And what do you think about comments which, I don't know, which are put inside PGSQL functions, for example?
What for? Is it to describe behavior, like almost like code comments?
Yeah, it can be an explanation of this, what this function does and every piece. Like if you, for example, look at Postgres code, it's very well commented.
Yes.
Right? Comments
Well,
are very thorough, right? They can be huge. Sometimes you open some C file, .c file, and a huge comment in the beginning explaining what's happening here.
Yeah.
Is it a good idea to put this to function bodies?
What's the downside? I think so. I generally err on the side of commenting things. I like comments. Although you brought up AI already, I do find some of the LLM commenting excessive at times, or like maybe not excessive in the sense that there's large comments. It's more that there are too many comments, just comments at too many stages. I do like the Postgres style, but they tend to be huge comment blocks describing a whole area, then loads of code, not like comments at each line of the code describing what each line's doing. So I like that style, but I tend to find that people, at least the databases I've seen over the years, aren't commented generally as well as people's applications. I see application code commented better on average than database code. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong projects, but personally, before knowing the downsides, would think it's a good idea. Are there downsides that I don't know about though?
First of all, I agree with you. If comment just explains what next line does, it's like in straightforward way, it's quite silly. Like or stupid, how to say it better. Yeah, it's a low value comment, right? But if it explains some knowledge and decision making, how it was made, some trade-offs which were made, this is super valuable. And right now, I think comments makes even more sense because sometimes when we engineer something and involve AI, we have some roadmap and some intention, and maybe first version is not final implementation of everything. So having to do comment, right? To do fix me, right? To do fix me. This is a meme comment, right? But these days, I think it's maybe, I just feel the shift here because it makes sense to comment some future intentions more often, because next time we will revisit this with AI as well. We probably improve in the same direction we wanted originally. So preserving context now is using comments makes a lot of sense. It's not always worth putting it as a comment right inside function body, because we might end up having huge, the plan inside function body, and this doesn't feel right, and it will consume a lot of bytes stored, right? So maybe some big comments should go as a separate document adjacent to the place, like in the same place where we store function in Git, for example. Maybe it's better documented separately, right? But when you do something and you say, okay, we do this, but we plan to extend it to this and this, I like these to-do comments because they are in the same place, and next time AI or you reading this, like you understand, okay, this is what we planned here, and so to-do fix me style makes more sense now. Because
I don't
have
know.
trade-off, we explain it, and we plan to fix it later. Why not? And
But that was always true. If you work in a team, if you work like in a style that's iterative, like any kind of agile process, any kind of extreme programming, that kind of let's do the minimum version and then let's iterate. That's always been true, hasn't it?
But it always also been true that a lot of dead code and a lot of such comments which have very little chance to be really improved. So you say to do fix me, you leave this comment, but you never return because of capacity.
Okay.
Now it's much easier to return and actually fix because we have AI. So
Sure, okay, I see what you mean now.
capacity changed, right? And you think, okay, actually, let's explain all the thing like in the comment right here, and we know we will revisit it if this code survives and if we don't drop it fully because of some different like understanding of like product or something.
Yeah.
We actually will improve. I start believing into this, right? Unlike pre-AI era when I knew nobody will have capacity to work on this because everyone is busy, too much everything and so on. And this is great actually. Right, so comments are good. If you don't leave comment, some weird decision made, code is hard to understand, like why it's so, then we are in trouble. And inline comment is great because AI won't miss it. It's reading this part, AI comment is here, all clear. But again, if it's some long document, it's better to offload it to some different part. And we slowly move to the topic we definitely wanted to discuss is database object level comments.
Oh, before we do, can I do one more for query level comments?
Yeah.
I just thought it was I'd forgotten about this until recently that this is how PG Hint Plan puts hints in, and I think it's true for other databases too. Different, not just Postgres. It's how hints. Yeah, it's fascinating to me. That's the method we've chosen. It makes sense, right? If we don't have hints at the database level, how else could we get them in at the query level other than putting them in a structured format inside a comment? And I didn't know, until reading the P-SQL thing, didn't know for sure why it was in a multi-line comment other than for readability. But yeah, I found it really interesting that it uses that syntax, probably because it gets stripped less often. So yeah, that seems to be another like big use case for query level comments.
PSQL doesn't strip C-like comments?
Doesn't strip the C style.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so you can use PG Hint Plan with P-SQL without
so
issues.
Back to functions. My approach is to have good comments, explaining intentions, context, plans maybe, but if it's a huge document, it should be offloaded. But we also have, for each function, we can create a separate metadata piece. We can say comment on function name, comment on function and function name. Have you seen how many variations comment on a statement has in Postgres? Have you seen?
So
44.
I didn't realize, and I think I might start using this more. But I didn't realize you could add comments to indexes.
Yeah.
That's really cool in the sense that sometimes you go to someone, like sometimes someone shows you they've got these 16 indexes, but they don't know like why certain ones were added. And wouldn't it be cool if you could just check the comments on as to what, you know,
on constraints, on sequences? Isn't it like fascinating?
I knew tables, I knew columns, I knew like general objects you could put comments on them, but I didn't know that there were
on
so
access
many options.
Methods, that's already hacky. Hacky. It's already too much, too deep. Yeah. So yeah, it's cool. 44 lines there.
And 44.
a funny thing in 2005 or 6 when we created first social network. It was Postgres plus PHP. And I, some time ago, not long ago, I stumbled upon an email, first review of my code from someone with experience, actually. And big criticism was like lack of comments at database object level. Can you imagine, 20 plus years ago? And I remember like actually how I was like protective and defensive.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a good thing. And my point right now is it always has been a good thing to have some approach in your project and use comments, because they can, sometimes they become like not valuable, right? You can have a comment to a table, but also for each column.
Yes.
And I remember I tried to enforce this in multiple teams I had in different projects. I tried to enforce this rule. Let's do it. After that review. Because I eventually agreed it's a good thing to have. This is just a lot of metadata. But I remember also seeing, okay, column ID, this is our ID. What comment can you put there on this column? I don't know. Sometimes there is no like extra meaning, right? Super simple column. But right now I think it's valuable to think about, and this is engineering level, this is what humans should think, maybe brainstorming with AI, but what should we really document at database object comments, in database object comments? And right now it's so easy, right? When we do something, there is no more excuse not to write tests for CI, because this is what AI does quite well. You just need to control it. And not just coverage, you should go deeper and say, okay, coverage is like a super simple thing. Okay, we have 80+%, but what does it really mean? We should cover edge cases, corner cases, really test things, right? And the same, it's the same documentation. And comments is our documentation. This is a part of project documentation. Database tables should have some comments, functions should have comments, columns as well. But of course, if it's like nothing to say about some simple column, okay, it can be skipped. But there should be some rule, and AI should be helping to maintain good comments, so later when you try to add more features or do refactoring, there is a great context. And also when you work with database, all those MCP servers, I don't know, APIs, like if you work with database and it can describe itself, it's a great thing to have, right? Instead of guessing the meaning of column just on column name, you have a comment. That's great. So now I think there is no excuse to avoid this powerful tool and have everything documented.
I think they raise some interesting things. I do think that being strict about it on ID columns, you make a perfect point. There's no point. But the place I've seen this super useful is reporting queries. So I think sometimes it can be quite complex to make sure you are like summing the right columns, or the column means what you think it means. Does this number, like this revenue number, what does it include? What doesn't it include? And that's like super relevant when you're trying to report stuff. And maybe sometimes like just the data person knows that, but if they can put it in comments on the schema, then their future, once they hire a team, those people can know it. And nowadays, if an LLM is writing reporting queries, they've got a better chance of getting that right rather than
fewer mistakes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the ideal schema, 2 columns, ID, column ID, and it's of type UUID, and we should have a comment. Never put ID, UUID version 4 here, always UUID version 7. And second column, data, JSONB. It's a joke, just in case.
Yeah. Sounds like Mongo.
Yeah. And then a comment which you extend all the time, extending schema of that JSONB, right? Explaining what's inside. Anyway, one of interesting cases we discussed recently, that was some project which was originally monolith, but they split the database into several pieces. Mm-hmm. So when you do this, you need to abandon some foreign keys, because you cannot have foreign keys between 2 clusters, between 2 primaries, right?
Yeah.
And I remember we discussed maybe we should maintain some fake foreign keys, like imaginary foreign keys, and define them in the comments. It was just an idea, right? Because who will be enforcing the rule that nobody will overwrite those comments? I don't know. But it's possible. So you have a column in one cluster saying that values here should match values of that column in that cluster. And periodically application or, I don't know, some additional tooling checks this. Anyway, tests and comments are super cheap to write these days. There should be some rule to enforce in every project to make them reach.
Yeah, not only are they cheaper though, I think they've always been valuable. I'm a big fan of tests. I love making changes to things and knowing that we haven't introduced any regressions. Like all the previous bugs now have tests that mean that we can't reintroduce them or reintroduce something similar. So I'm a big fan of tests. I'm a big fan of comments, but I think their value might even be going up in this new world. Like I think it's not just that they're just as valuable and cheaper to add, but I think they might be even more valuable. Like I would be super scared letting an AI make changes to an application that doesn't have good test coverage these days. Just the value of tests for me is going up even higher because I have less trust that people have properly reviewed things. So do you see where I'm coming from? That actually these things might be even more valuable.
About
like comments
quality.
I think so. And yeah, checking, obviously getting it to add these things is one thing, but then checking that there is a reasonable comment, that it is documenting what you think that column is or does. Yeah, I can see that. The one thing I was going to ask you though is, what do you think about index comments? Do you use them?
Honestly, I don't remember I used them ever. But it makes sense to document why we created this index, right?
I think so. I even think maybe because we re-index, right, sometimes for bloat maintenance. I was even thinking like when we added it, who added it, what for? There might be some interesting metadata in
That's
there.
interesting. That's interesting. And not only index, I think, I remember cases when I thought, oh, damn, I wish we could establish proper, we could figure out when something was really created in Postgres. Some table or index.
Function.
If you, for example, establish a rule that when you create something or rebuild index, you document it in a comment, why not? It's an interesting idea, actually. Probably I should borrow it for our PG index pilot project, which reindexes automatically.
Yeah, so if a lot of people are using ORMs that they'll have the source control of this, right? Like they can look up when was this first created, and hopefully that comes with a commit
or
message
looking at logs.
Yeah,
which is not easy usually.
Looking at logs.
Logs.
Also,
if you document DDL,
but how long do people store those for?
If it's a serious project, usually we have something like Elastic and store it for quite long. Not forever, I agree.
Yeah.
It's a lot, yeah.
But indexes could easily have been created years ago and people...
I now remember... Actually, this is also interesting. I remember in PGIndex pilot, we of course have a couple of tables where we store such metadata and all the history of rebuilding and so on.
Nice.
Yeah, and this is interesting. This is to think pros and cons of storing some metadata in a comment versus you have specific table and store it there. Pros and cons are not obvious to me because, of course, comment is closer, right? It's easier than to consume. But you don't have history, for example. Only
of course, current
additional
comments.
table, you need to maintain it and so on. Pros of storing some comments separately is also permissions. Sometimes you want to store some data which you don't want regular users to observe, for example. It's very specific nuance for your goals, right? But yeah. Last thing we wanted to mention is this blog post from Andrei Lepikhov.
Yeah.
An interesting idea to use security labels as metadata storage. It's quite elegant, I think, and we discussed before. So the idea is that we need some metadata storage, but instead of creating a table and write it there, in that case, it was PGH, so it was related to probably multi-master solution and logical replication, bidirectional logical replication, something. So the idea was, let's use these security labels coming from integration with SE Linux, so security stuff, and benefit from the fact that you can put anything there, and for different users, unlike, for example, comment, which is single comment for database object, there you can have multiple metadata pieces belonging to specifically like to each user. So it's one-to-many relationship. So it's interesting. And putting there some custom data, why not actually? Yeah. And
so it's called security labels, but I guess you could just think of them as labels.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I never thought about this, and maybe there are different use cases where you can benefit from this. If you need specific comments for specific users for this particular database object.
Yeah, many options.
Yeah, anyway, comments should be used more in the AI era. Like table level, index level, I like it a lot. Never used, but I'm going to think.
Yeah, and even if you're somewhere that isn't using AI stuff all the time, I don't know how many of them there are these days, but just I think these are useful anyway, even for teams that are collaborating. Like this, comments are good for communication generally.
Good.
All right. Nice one, Nikolai. Thanks so much for this, and catch you next time.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.